Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my personal podcast tour of the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe. VOODOO Man, 1944. Having gained a temporary reprieve from his Monogram 9 contract to do Columbia's marginally better Return of the Vampire, Bela Lugosi was soon back to hacking away in the salt mine of schlock on his last two contractual obligations. The next to be released, but actually filmed second, was the dull and dreadful VOODOO Man, whose only saving grace was a chance to see him teamed up with two other noted horror actors, George Zucco and John Carradine. However, here his co-stars are only required to be one noted, which somewhat scuppers the definition of value for money. Once more, producers Sam Katzman and Jack Dietz assembled a script, cast and crew in the same way a toddler assembles playpen bricks, though without any of the worthwhile results. Our old friend William One-Take Bodine directed again, still proving, as we will see, that as long as the players are alive and making vaguely coherent sounds before the camera, that's good enough to move on to the next location. The tragic excuse for a plot and dialogue is passable in the same way as a kidney stone, invisibly and painfully. The writer Robert Charles was only credited with one other screenplay, the same year's infamous Return of the Ape Man. Lugosi plays the Lenin-bearded Dr. Marlowe, a variation on his gallery of urbane and insane mesmerics that by now took no more energy from him than a screensaver. He is engaged in abducting beautiful young women not for the old chestnut of sinister research, but the equally overused warhorse of reviving his wife's suspended animation, which at least allows him the extra inspiration of spousal grief he channeled in 1934's The Black Cat. It could be worse, he could be George Zucco. You know you're in for a rough ride when the normally better appointed Zucco takes a poor second to him in a horror movie. The seemingly indestructible high priest of Universal's Mummy sequels had some downtime before one last burn of the incense in The Mummy's Ghost. Here, as Nicholas, he begins by serving as a gas station lookout, alerting fellow conspirators of incoming potential victims. The first prey we see is Alice, Terry Walker, whose exit is given Zucco's beady-eyed stare of intent before he reaches for the phone. Competing for the title of MUVP, Most Undervalued Player, is John Carradine as one of the two henchmen. Following his brace of mad scientist roles in 1943's Captive Wild Woman and Revenge of the Zombies, both of which I've covered, the talent that gave us Jim Casey's hobo preacher in John Ford's poetic Grapes of Wrath has to make do with being a scrawny simpleton in the employ of Dr. Marlowe. He would spiral even further down the lurid funhouse slide of bad movies in the future. Along with Pat McKee's Grego, he sets up road diversions, luring the ladies into nebulous medical experimentation. Meanwhile, Ralph, Todd Andrews, is a Hollywood screenwriter, visiting his boss at the Banner Motion Picture Company. Yes, the same firm who in real life made these demolition derby wrecks for Monogram. To further the in-joke, his boss S.K., John Ince, shares the same initials as Monogram producer Sam Katzman. The newspaper coverage of these victims' disappearances piques S.K.'s interest as a movie idea, inexplicably so since the article literally only states that 3 have vanished that month along with their cars. Some kind of horror story, he suggests. Presumably from such soggy clay are Monogram sculptures thrown together. Ralph is luckier in his coincidental meetings than in his employment. On his way to see his fiancée, he runs out of gas and is picked up by Stella Saunders, another spunky role for Louise Curry after her sassy photographer in The Ape Man. She just happens to be his fiancée's cousin. When her car breaks down, Stella is kidnapped by the redneck henchman while Ralph goes to that same house to use their phone for help, thus ending his run of freakish good luck. Stella and Ralph now find themselves embroiled in the bizarre cult shenanigans of Marlowe and Nicholas, who are attempting to find a suitable girl with a perfect affinity to mentally link with Marlowe's wife Evelyn, Ellen Hall, thus reviving her from a 22-year catatonic state. Nicholas is convinced that the goddess he worships holds the key. But remember, Rambuna is all-powerful. She'd need to be, as the 3-stage process they must undergo to invoke her is bafflingly funny. Lugosi sits between wife and captive subject Stella, intoning vague nonsense about emotion to emotion, life to death, recalling Spock's superior mind melds in Star Trek. Meanwhile, McKee and Carradine sit in on bongos. At one point, a shot of the latter's whacked-out banging suggests that what he's channeling instead is a Woodstock hippie who touched the brown acid. The worst casualty, though, is Zuko. From this point on, Nicholas is an embarrassingly attired, laughably threadbare, gobbledygook-spouting version of his aforementioned universal role. He and Lugosi both sport comedy sketch ceremonial occult robes, black silk adorned with stars, and a large, obviously symbolic 7, less The Devil Rides Out and more The Wizard of Oz, that couldn't telegraph more obviously if they advertised "I'm up to no good" on the back. Poor George suffers the even greater indignity of a leopard skin bandana, topped with a crazy fright wig and a child's red Indian face paint. There are so many interminable inserts of his satanic mumbo-jumbo delivery at the altar that he'd have been better turning it into a cash bar for fun and profit. Dr. Marlowe grows increasingly frustrated that he can't find a woman with the right spiritual faculties to bring Evelyn back to him. She is so delicate, bless her, that he warns his sinister housekeeper, Mrs. Benton, that a sudden bright light will disintegrate her. Someone should have told cinematographer Marcel Le Picard, since in every scene he bathes everyone in strong lamps, most notably when Lugosi is shown doing his Svengali mesmerism. His face is often almost clown-white in close-ups under a generalized light blast. There is no need to compound the confusion by delving too deeply into the remaining dregs of plot. Ralph reunites with fiancée Betty, Wanda Mackay, and they become amateur sleuths, getting to the remarkably shallow bottom of the mystery disappearances. They rescue Stella from post-experimental wandering in the forest, prompting Betty to observe, "You know, I've seen people act like that in pictures. What do they call them? Zombies or something?" Before we can remark about the alternate name of contract players, the coincidence hits keep on coming, as Dr. Marlowe is brought in to examine Stella. Gleefully, they have played into his hands by presenting him with his missing victim, albeit with such a layman's recommendation of bed rest that it isn't long before the couple suspect him of foul play. That's just as well, as Marlowe has Nicholas remotely hypnotize Betty into coming to him as a much more promising catalyst for Evelyn. The virtual Miss America pageant of 4 lovely women kept on hand in the basement and pored over by the babbling Carradine shows that even Monogram had access to the deluge of young hopefuls continually bussing into Tinseltown. Mind you, looks will only get you so far. When the sheriff, Henry Hall, finally shoots Dr. Marlowe dead, the awakened version of Evelyn is just as sleepy as the catatonic one. The epilogue ends Voodoo Man with more of the tongue-in-cheek humor that it began with, whereby Ralph returns to SK, having turned his wacky adventures into a screenplay. Voodoo Man, eh? Is it any good? Asks his boss. By way of an answer, Ralph suggests, "Why don't you get that actor Bela Lugosi? It's right up his alley." Leaving aside whether this qualifies as truth or defamation of character, Voodoo Man, the celluloid suppository, certainly went that way. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe.